stand, or else I might fall asleep on you. Friends, it's good to be here again. It's a trifle paradoxical that I, who have a passionate dislike for all things Windrush, I'm giving this lecture. I'm doing it for two reasons. One, out of respect for this good woman and that one and their team in Voices of Windrush. And two, because I believe we need to have these conversations. There will always be contradictions amongst us. And there will always be controversial figures amongst us. And I'd like to engage with some of them, including Jamie Lammy. So what I want to do today really is to reflect and invite you to reflect upon the events around England in August this year, late July, August, following the tragic murder of these young children in Southport in July. And clearly there's much that one can say about that. What I want to focus on, however, is the relationship between that and the state of Britain. By state, I mean condition, as well as the nation state that we're in. So, some 60 years ago, it was 60 years on the 20th of August this year, I arrived at Heathrow Airport from Grenada, not on a remade or remastered Windrush, but on British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOAC, which was the precursor of British Airways. And I arrived 2 months before the 1964 general election, October that year. Immigration and race dominated that election, with Peter Griffiths, the Conservative candidate in Smethwick in the West Midlands, declaring as part of his campaigning pitch, campaigning slogan, if you want a nigger for a neighbor, vote Labour. Griffiths won his seat with a 7.5% swing from Labour, thereby defeating the Shadow Foreign Secretary Patrick Gordon Walker. Roll on 60 years. A week before this last general election, a campaigner for the Reform Party was calling the outgoing Prime Minister an effing packy. Reform went on to win 5 seats. In the intervening 60 years, we witnessed a proliferation of far-right groups of British citizens burying their loved ones as a result of nigger hunting and packy bashing. Murders of British citizens from South Asia became normalized in much the same way that police killings, euphemistically called deaths in custody, were normalized, with the police involved in such events being treated as witnesses rather than suspects, even when the deaths resulted from their use of excessive force. So the likelihood is that neo-fascist perpetrators of such human rights violations are now sitting in the British Parliament as MPs, reform MPs, and running around in police uniforms. It was not so surprising, therefore, to hear a reform MP say, in response to calls for a policeman caught on camera kicking a black man in his head and then stamping on it during a fracas at Manchester Airport, I'm sure you remember it well, that the policeman should be given a medal rather than being criticized. A serving MP, who, as a member of Parliament, is supposed to be representing all the people in his constituencies, irrespective of background, ethnicity, or whatever else. It took me and others as activists decades of lobbying before we persuaded Parliament to even contemplate designating certain crimes racially aggravated. As a matter of fact, it was not until 1998 that the Crime and Disorder Act, sections 29 to 32, created specific racially or religiously aggravated offenses. In the early 2000s, I was commissioned by the Crown Prosecution Service to conduct research as to how prosecutors made decisions regarding cases involving race and gender, including racially aggravated offenses. David Calvert-Smith, now a judge, was the Director of Public Prosecutions at that time. So I chose 1,500 closed cases from each of 10 CPS areas around the country, totaling 15,000. And my team and I studied all of those 15,000 files. I was alarmed by the repeated pattern of defense lawyers and CPS engaging in plea bargaining and making deals which involved prosecutors agreeing to drop the racially aggravated component of the offending. So, for example, if the window of a shop belonging to a Pakistani shopkeeper was smashed, but in addition the shop was sprayed with racial abuse, prosecutors would agree to a guilty plea to criminal damage in exchange for the racially aggravated element of the charge being dropped. This was a systematic pattern. And my friend, Rajiv Menon, now KC, and our colleague, Hussein, gathered the evidence and presented it to the then Attorney General, Peter Goldsmith, who was quite appalled by what was going on and immediately issued instructions preventing prosecutors from reaching deals, which meant that the racially aggravated aspect of offending could be dropped. And of course, the reason for that is that racially or religiously aggravated offenses, even now, attract stiffer sentences. So going back to Southport, many of us are old enough to remember the Hungerford Massacre on the 17th of August 1987, in which Michael Ryan, a white male, murdered 16 people by gunshot before turning the gun on himself. 9 years later, 13th of March 1996, Thomas Hamilton, another white male, murdered 16 young children and their teacher in Dunblane in Scotland. On both those occasions, the entire nation was in mourning and in a state of shock. There was no hint of revenge or civil unrest. nor did anyone automatically assume that the gunman might have been a foreign national, let alone a jihadist. But when the racialization of immigration segues into the racialization of crime, mugging, sus, drug pushing, and now senseless murders, the country has a nervous breakdown, and every aggrieved and dispossessed white citizen, every ferret-eyed racist, every far-right patriot feels they have a civic duty to claim their country back by any means necessary. No politician of any party could distance themselves from the racist rhetoric which helped to create the context and political culture in which rumors could spread like wildfire regarding the ethnicity, the faith, the immigration status of the suspect in the murder of those young children in the dance class in Southport on Monday, 29th of July. Not only was the attacker assumed to be Muslim and given a Muslim-sounding name, he was also reported as having entered Britain illegally on one of those small boats that have been the subject of political discourse for the last few years, and especially in the run-up to the recent general election. In April 2023, writing in the Mail on Sunday, that hideous human being, Suella Braverman, then Home Secretary, claimed that child grooming gangs in the UK were almost all British Pakistani, who had, quotes, cultural attitudes completely incompatible with British values, and that those gangs have been left mostly unchallenged, both within their communities and by wider society, end of quote. The press regulator, IPSO, ruled in September 2023 in response to a complaint from the Center for Media Monitoring that Braverman's decision to link, quotes, the identified ethnic group and a particular form of offending was significantly misleading, end of quote, because the Home Office's own research had concluded offenders were mainly from white backgrounds. In May 2023, Braverman, a barrister, described small boats crossing the English Channel as an invasion, adding that small boat crossings meant heightened levels of criminality. She went to the same school as that other clown across the water called Donald Trump. This led to 9 organizations referring her to the Bar Standards Board for breaching the barrister's code relating to the use of racist language. 2 years earlier, her predecessor, Priti Patel, or not so Priti Patel, was fulminating and venting her frustration with lawyers who had intervened on behalf of the clients to prevent her deporting 45 convicted offenders to Jamaica. And our dear Zita knows a lot about that one. On the morning of the 10th of August 2015, 81-year-old Mushin Ahmed was savagely set upon, kicked, punched, and his head and face stamped upon savagely by 2 white racists from Rotherham, Dale Jones and Damian Hunt, both 29 years old. Mr. Ahmed was attacked as he walked to mosque during Ramadan. And he was attacked just a short distance from his front door. His attackers accused him indiscriminately of being a groomer in child sexual exploitation. Mr. Ahmed, a Yemeni, not a Pakistani, a Yemeni, died of his injuries 11 days later at the age of 81. Members of local fascist groups would later gloat gleefully and provocatively about the racist murder of Mohsen Ahmed. Exactly 2 years later, on the 10th of August 2017, even as Mr. Ahmed's family and community remembered his horrific murder for no other reason than that he was a Muslim male from Rotherham and therefore labeled with the moniker groomer, the Member of Parliament, this time Labour, Sarah Champion, was fanning the flames of racial hatred by calling out, again, British Pakistani men as sexual predators who work in gangs to groom and sexually exploit white pubescent girls. So here was a Member of Parliament, a Labour MP, whom the Ahmed family and the Pakistani community had a right to expect to conduct herself differently, effectively doing what the neo-fascist murderers of their loved one had done, motivated as they were by hatred of Muslim Pakistani men as a collective for sexual exploitation of white girls. She could have gone to the family to empathize with them on the 2nd anniversary of the barbaric racist murder of that elder in the community. Or she could have written an article condemning the murder and reminding the nation of the dangers of making an entire section of the British population responsible for or capable of the criminal acts of one minute group of individuals within that section of the population as defined by ethnicity and religion. She could have written that in addition to white pubescent girls, some 120, estimated 120 young Muslim girls and young women were also victims of that predatory lot. Instead, she marked the 2nd anniversary of that gruesome murder with her inflammatory article in the Sun newspaper. So, might there be a correlation between the leadership shown by these elected representatives of the people, Conservative and Labour, and the decision of self-styled influencers to post false and incendiary, racist and Islamophobic information online about the assumed identity of the assailant who stabbed those innocent children in their dance class in Southport. In other words, what I'm saying, my friends, is that we've got to join up the dots. There is a correlation between the fact that the British government over decades, with every new piece of immigration legislation, was making sure that less and less black people could come to this country. We've known that for some while. That suppressed report, which they released only recently, confirmed what we have known for some while. The discourse on race and immigration is conducted by leaders of state, the political class, and the media at this time as if this was still 1968, when Enoch Powell, MP, was warning of rivers of blood and of Britain in its essence being eclipsed by a growing black presence. There appears to be no acknowledgement of the existential reality that in Britain today, the reality is of a settled multi-ethnic society whose citizens are getting on with their lives, irrespective of ethnicity, pursuing their ambitions, and contributing to the society and its progress wherever they find themselves. They are not immigrants, first, second, third, or fourth generation. They are not Windrush descendants or any other such banal designation. Their citizenship defines their Britishness, a Britishness that cannot be denied them because the society defines them and their offspring as BAME, assumedly for all time. So politicians, black and white, who play to the gallery and engage in a discourse that projects those citizens as other, not belonging and not having the right to belong, the right to have and practice a religion and belief of their choice, a right to cultural production and expression, those politicians and leaders are simply maintaining the boundaries of division and rendering citizens vulnerable and unentitled. But the background to all of that is that Britain has signally failed, as some of you would have heard me argue before, signally failed to deal with the legacy of empire and the impact of that legacy on its own social history, its definition of itself as a nation, and its relationship with the rest of the world. Crucially, it has failed to assist its citizens, especially the white majority, in understanding their own history, as well as Britain's legal and moral obligations to those it once colonized, and whose natural resources it continues to extract and exploit for its benefit and to the detriment of those former colonies themselves to this day. And as Zita reminded us, Sivanandan, the late director of the Institute of Race Relations, summed it up most succinctly in 7 simple words when he said, "We are here because you were there." But populism serves the political parties and the ruling classes well. The far right cannot be allowed to claim that they are speaking on behalf of the dispossessed, disenfranchised, and left behind in the society, their central thesis being that all of the latter were caused by the presence of black people through immigration and by the state's failure to ensure that no more are let in. And it is against that background we have to understand the so-called Windrush scandal. But what is deficient about that designation, Windrush scandal, and therefore historically wrong, is that the activities of immigration officers and border control people in relation to the group of people who become known as the Windrush victims have been going on for some considerable time and affecting not just people from the Caribbean, people from the African continent, people from South Asia. I, as the head of a black organization in Manchester, led any number of anti-deportation campaigns involving both black people, for example, Anthony Brown, who now runs a legal defense group within Manchester to do with Windrush, and some Pakistani women who had fled their homes and gone to women's refuges because of physical and sexual abuse in their homes by in-laws and men associated with their families. And the husbands had made application to the Home Office that they should all be sent back because they came as brides, and once they had left the matrimonial home, they had forfeited the right to remain in the country. And we had to take them on. To the extent that for months I received all kinds of death threats from people associated with the Islamic Council in Manchester, because they were wondering, what is this African fool from the Caribbean getting involved in our affairs for? And we had to remind them that these people may have been, or might still be, their wives, but they're not their property. And every single one of them have got individual human rights. And we were going to defend those human rights, irrespective of what they said or did. So, my point is that, and I agree totally with what Zita was saying, the community organized itself around those matters and that emerging scandal, even before Amelia Gentleman went and did her work and wrote it in The Guardian. And the fact of the matter is that those gatekeepers, whether it be The Guardian, The Independent, BBC, and all of that hopeless lot, they determine what they validate and who they validate in terms of those issues. So we who are struggling in our communities and building communities of resistance have got to be begging for them to take us seriously and to not validate. We don't need the validation, but do their work and report the damn thing. They don't do that. And I have total respect for Amelia Gentleman. But at the same time, none of them would look at the irony of somebody like that, a journalist coming out of King's Cross and the Guardian office and going and working with precisely the same people that Zita was talking about. That's how she managed to get the information. But then she had access, by virtue of being a journalist on The Guardian, and could splash the whole thing around the place in the way that Zita and Barak and all of those people could not do. So even as we respond to state oppression, there are filters in terms of who determines what and what have you. And so Amelia does her work. Other people take it seriously because it is Amelia and The Guardian, and she gets plaudits and prizes and journalistic rewards for all of that. Meanwhile, the world doesn't know that this woman and all of those around her, and Jacqueline McKenzie, and all of those whom she spent night after night after night supporting, were responsible as well for keeping people away from ships and planes that were taking them back to the Caribbean. Now I want to say two more things about this. One is this, that, as I said, we have to join up the dots. However much Keir Starmer and the courts might want to put these far-right people in jail for significant lengths of time, now, we have been complaining for decades about their activities. We all remember that the government introduced in the 1980s the PREVENT program. And they were obsessed with the radicalization of Muslim youth. So even people who ran day nurseries were supposed to be reporting on whether they found anything strange about what the children in their nurseries were babbling about. Universities, nurseries, primary schools, secondary schools, everybody had a duty to report with this PREVENT program. So the whole nation was focused upon finding jihadists in every madrasa, under every bed. And children were being targeted for no other reason than they were Muslim and associated with people whom the government thought were involved in extremism. But then we've been saying to the government for ages that they can't ignore the work of the National Front. They can't ignore the activities of Column 88. They can't ignore the activities of Britain First and all of that rapidly expanding group of far-right people. And yes, the Paki bashing was real. And people were incinerated in the beds because these racists would go and put firebombs through the letterboxes and set the police alight at 3 o'clock in the morning. Each single one of those events was treated as one other aberration. In other words, this kind of stuff is not us. It doesn't define us. It's not reflective of our fundamental British values. And so the police managed to get some people into court. Most of them were not even prosecuted. But there were funerals regularly of Asian people dying. I used to teach some people whose grandfather was killed at Seven Kings railway station. The man is doing his job, collecting tickets. And some white racists, about 5 or was it 9 of them, coming out of a train that night, decide that they ain't paying anybody. And when he decided that he was going to intervene, took out a crossbow and shot him through his neck. So 1 minute he's doing his job, next minute he's lying dead with a crossbow in his neck. Those kinds of things were happening regularly. And when we told the British government that those acts should be classified as domestic terrorism, they resisted that. They did not believe that it was proper to use the term terrorism to describe those kinds of stuff. Because terrorism is an extension of Muslim extremism or jihadism, and you use it only in relation to the activities of Muslim people. Which is why in an article I wrote for the Gleaner magazine, or journal, whatever it is, I said about this matter that you cannot sow corn and expect to reap cassava. If you allow all of that stuff to go on decade after decade after decade, then it culminates in what we saw after Southport. And I want to end with this. You can jail as many of those people as you like, but if you continue not to attend to that legacy of empire and deal head on with the issue of racism, race remains the elephant in the room. Head teachers don't want to talk about it. University vice principals don't want to talk about it. The NHS doesn't want to talk about it. And everybody just skirting around it. And when they're not skirting around it, they're tickling its underbelly. That is how race is being dealt with. But yet, in the late 1980s, the Institute of Race Relations produced a fantastic series that looked like this. This one is called How Racism Came to Britain, Book 3. And it's a set of cartoons that assist children or people of all ages with a kind of timeline of how racism was spawned by colonialism and imperialism. This one, Patterns of Racism. It's a not so cartoonish, but a packed history of racism and how it was embedded within the DNA of the society. And there are more. Currently, the Labour government is pursuing a curriculum review. And in another piece I wrote recently, and I quoted it in my fan mail to dear David Lammy, Keir Starmer, speaking at the annual conference, whatever it is, of the Holocaust Memorial Trust, went on and on and on about this curriculum review and was pledging there and then, even before the review takes place, that it will contain two things. It would make sure that every child has a knowledge of the Holocaust and can not just know about it, but own it, and it should become part of their consciousness and of the national consciousness. And then he pledged that the Holocaust memorial that was going to be built in the near to the Parliament was going to be built. He would make sure of that. The British government a couple of years ago pledged £150 million towards that. And yet when Memorial 2007, made up principally by a number of black people after the 2007 bicentenary of the abolition of the trade in enslaved Africans, when they asked the government for £4 million to help them to create and place a statue to the memory of enslaved Africans in Hyde Park, the government wrote to them saying, we have no money. 4 million as compared to 150 million. And this clown gets up and triumphantly says to the Holocaust Memorial people, the monument will be built next to Parliament as a sign that the whole nation is committed to making sure that the Holocaust never happens again. Never happens again to Jewish people while they are imposing a Holocaust on Palestinians right now as we speak. So my point is this, that the government, and we have to make sure that this curriculum review that's taking place now does take on the issue of the legacy of empire. What does that mean? How has it etched itself into the consciousness of the entire nation? And what does it mean for the fact that my grandchildren, your grandchildren and children are having to go to school and hopefully be equipped with the knowledge, the skills, the understanding, the aptitudes that would enable them together to build a society that is not characterized by the toxicity of racism. And that's an urgent agenda for us. Because we are being led, and these are my words, not yours, right? We're being led by a Zionist dunderhead called Keir Starmer, who is treating Britain as if it was some Gibraltar of Israel's. And we can't allow it to happen. We can't allow that hideous definition by the International Holocaust Memorial people to tell us that if we criticize the state of Israel for what it is doing, we are being anti-Semitic. And that's what he wants teachers to teach our children. And we've got to push back against that nonsense. So we gave our votes and we put these people in there But we cannot allow an elective dictatorship with Keir Starmer at the zenith, at the top of it all, that actually distorts our own reality, i.e. of a people whose suffering over 4 centuries is being simply airbrushed out of the argument. And this stupid man trying to tell the nation that all of that is in the past and we should forget about it, and what he's concerned about now is supporting those people who are suffering from tornadoes and hurricanes and so on and so forth now and then. And I ask myself, how long would it be before we are being told that Hitler and his industrial death camps are a thing of the past, and that we should not, the state of Israel should not be holding the world to ransom because of what Hitler did? We've got to push back against that nonsense. And frankly, I couldn't give 2 monkeys pink backsides. Who decides that I am an anti-Semite? Bring it on. We've got to be bold about these things, because they are still profiting from what our forefathers and mothers, our ancestors did to build these nations. And as our dear sister here said, yeah, it's only a few years ago, 2015, that we ourselves stopped paying for the money they borrowed to pay these 20 million pounds to the owners of enslaved Africans. So we're living, my friends, in a very serious moment in this country. And it is not just these extreme far-right groups that are wanting to organize themselves, not just in Britain, but across Europe. We have to be very concerned about the state and orientation of our own so-called mainstream political parties, because it does not augur well.